Welcome to Wednesday and Victory's virtual workshop, where I try to create confidence and clarity for your financial life. I'm Patrick Huey, and today is April the 24th, 2024. And today we're talking about the personal consumption expenditure, or PCE. That PCE price index, which became the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation gauge starting around the year 2000. Now, that particular shift occurred after the Fed and Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan highlighted its advantages in a report, the Monetary Policy Report, to Congress. Today, the Fed sees it as a more comprehensive measurement of inflation than other reports like the CPI. We'll talk a little bit about why and what this might mean for you specific to your portfolio. But seeing it as a more comprehensive measurement, the PCE index's methodology, it captures a broader spectrum of consumption patterns and behaviors compared to other inflation metrics like that CPI or Consumer Price Index. And the theory is that this inclusivity allows for a more nuanced understanding of inflationary trends, considering shifts in consumer preferences, technological advancements, healthcare, housing, durable goods. The PCE index provides a more, air quoting here, a holistic view of price movements affecting consumers' purchasing power. And that's important because the Fed employs an inflation targeting framework that aims to achieve a very specific moderate inflation rate over the long term. Now, long term is a key phrase there. But by anchoring inflation expectations around a target of 2%, policymakers are looking to promote price stability and avoid the detrimental effects of both deflation and hyperinflation. Now, the PCE index serves as the primary reference point for evaluating whether the inflation is tracking in line with that target of 2%. If inflation deviates from that desired level, well, the Fed steps in and adjusts its policy stance accordingly to hopefully steer the economy back toward the target trajectory. Policy responses to inflationary pressures or rises above 2% in the PCE would include things like a monetary policy looking to temper excessive price growth. And what does that mean? It means they're going to raise short-term interest rates to discourage borrowing and spending, and thereby cooling down the aggregate demand in the economy. And that, over time, should alleviate inflationary pressures. So, in essence, when inflation gets out of that 2% target band, like it is now, interest rates go up to counter that. And conversely, if the PCE index indicates inflation is running below the target rate, remember it used to do that back 10 years or so ago, or if there are looming deflationary risks like we thought there were in 07 and 08, the Fed will deploy expansionary monetary policy to stimulate economic activity, meaning it will lower interest rates to encourage borrowing and investment, and they'll implement quantitative easing to inject money back into the financial markets. And their forward guidance would say, we're doing all these things in order to support spending, to support the economy, and ease any deflationary pressures that are present in the economy. This was basically, like I said, what was done from about 2008 until 2020. Money was very easy, and monetary policy was supportive of trying to make sure that we didn't go into a deflationary spiral versus hyperinflation. Now, the Fed continuously assesses the incoming economic data. You could say they obsess over it, including PCE readings, and they're looking to adapt their policy stance in response to evolving macroeconomic conditions, which they don't change as much as people think. So the language of the Fed tends to be very nuanced, And that can be fairly frustrating for market participants, especially if they're looking for the Fed to do something and trying to gauge when that will happen. Like they are now, trying to gauge when the Fed would cut rates again to go back to a more accommodative stance for the economy. So the relationship between the PCE index and monetary policy is a cornerstone, like it or not, of modern macroeconomic management. And the PCE is the main tool that the Fed uses for assessing inflationary pressures and then for guiding their policy decisions and hopefully fostering long-term economic stability. But the real question I had, and I think a lot of people have had as well, is, okay, I hear a lot more about the CPI or the consumer price index. What's the difference? Is the CPE any different than CPI? Well, PCE and the CPI, there are differences. Now, they're nuanced, and they're both two widely used measures of inflation. But here are the general differences between the two. First is the scope of goods and services. The PCE index encompasses a much broader range of goods and services compared to the CPI. It includes expenditures not only by households, but also by nonprofit institutions serving households like churches and universities. And it includes government consumption expenditures as well, things like defense and Social Security, which are fairly high-ticket items. The CPI primarily focuses on expenditures made by urban households for a predefined basket of goods and services. It does not include expenditures by rural households, military personnel, and institutionalized individuals. So it's a much narrower data set with the CPI than the PCE. Second difference is the weighting methodology. PCE its weights are assigned to various components within the PCE based on actual consumer spending patterns. And these are updated annually. That means that as consumer behavior changes over time, so do the weights, reflecting shifts in consumption preferences. On the other hand, CPI, those weights are derived from expenditure surveys conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but they're updated a lot less frequently. And as a result, the CPI may not always capture the most current consumption patterns. Third difference is the coverage of price changes. The PCE index adjusts for changes in consumer behavior, noted substitution bias, and it does so more dynamically compared to the CPI. This means that if the price of a specific item increases, and hey, these days, what item isn't increasing? Consumers may switch to alternative, cheaper substitutes. And the PCE index reflects this adjustment. CPI, however, measures price changes for a fixed basket of goods and services, and it assumes no change in consumer behavior. So as a result, it may overstate inflation to some extent because it does not account for consumers' ability to substitute cheaper alternatives when prices rise. Fourth difference is the treatment of housing costs. The PCE index includes a measure of housing costs that reflects the rental equivalent approach. It means we're capturing the cost of housing services rather than actual expenditures. And this accounts for homeowners' implicit rent, basically the amount of rent you would pay on your own home, and is considered to provide a more accurate representation of true housing costs. Meanwhile, the CPI incorporates housing costs based on a combination of rental prices for tenants and owners' equivalent rents. And the CPI's treatment of housing costs is probably a little bit more comprehensive, although some critics argue that it may not fully capture changes in housing market dynamics like fluctuations in property values, meaning it's just not fast enough to keep up with changes in property values. Okay, so those are some differences between the two measurements. The Federal Reserve tends to prefer the PCE index. Now, if you're a pessimist, you say, well, of course they do, because it tends to have a lower reading inflation-wise than the CPI does. But beyond that, it's considered to have a broader scope, and it's got some methodological advantages, including the use of those weightings and the way they treat housing costs. Meanwhile, the CPI is probably the most widely recognized, okay, at least by the general public, as far as how we measure inflation or deflation. So Federal Reserve prefers PCE, at least since the year 2000, but most of us recognize or pay attention to the CPI. So what really is the difference? Well, according to this chart that we've had up on the screen, tracking them, it's really not that much. Since the year 2000, the annualized gain in the PCE price index has been about 0.4 percentage points lower than the CPI. We just talked about that. CPI, at least to me, seems to be higher when inflation is spiking, but it tracks pretty well with PCE and CPI at most other times. So what does that mean to you? Well, we get the supposed benefit of having 2 data points now per month on inflation, where it used to just be 1. And markets, at least in the most recent inflationary environment, have shown that they are prone to react to either of them being out of the 2% target band. Now, twice as much data, if it's twice as much of the same data, doesn't make us twice as smart. But it does make things potentially twice as volatile when the numbers aren't going the Fed's way. So to summarize, there's very little difference between these two numbers, but the fact that we get them both once a month makes things a little more interesting, potentially a little bit more volatile for your portfolio. That's all I have. Thanks for being with me today. Be on the lookout in my weekly briefing emails for the next topic for our virtual workshop. And thanks, everybody. We'll see you next Wednesday.